What is a Calvinist? What is a Calvinist? I sometimes get asked the question, are you a Calvinist? Because I've spent a lot of time studying Calvin, and I never answer it because I don't know what they mean by that. So let me give you 5 possible meanings. And the first one is a Calvinist is someone who believed what Calvin believed. And Richard Muller, who's written a lot on Calvin and Calvinism, made the very good observation that if that's the definition of a Calvinist, there's only ever been one Calvinist. Although that's perhaps not quite true. Lyndon Johnson, the US president, is reputed to have said that if 2 people think exactly the same, only one of them has thought. And we all think slightly differently. So what is a Calvinist? It's not someone who believes exactly the same as Calvin. And then you might say, well, a Calvinist is somebody, a Protestant who is Reformed rather than Lutheran. Because at the beginning of the Reformation, right at the beginning, there was Luther in Germany and then Zwingli in Zurich. And they were both introducing Reformation. And out of these flowed from Luther, the Lutheran Reformation, Scandinavia, Germany mainly, and then obviously spreading around the world. And from Zwingli, you get the Swiss Reformation, which spread to France, although unsuccessfully, and to Great Britain and to parts of Eastern Europe and so on. So 2 strands of the Reformation. So are you a Calvinist might simply mean, are you a Lutheran or a Calvinist? Which of these streams of Protestantism do you belong to? Just as anybody in Finland who belongs to a Lutheran church is presumably called a Lutheran. And so you might say anyone who belongs not just to a whole range of churches. The Methodists come out of that Reformed as opposed to Lutheran tradition. Baptists in that sense flow out of the Reformed rather than Lutheran tradition. So it could be meant in that very broad sense. But that's not normally what people mean. Or thirdly, it could mean, do you belong to a specifically Reformed church, like the Presbyterian church in Britain especially, and then from Britain in America? Or on the continent, they're generally called Reformed. So do you specifically belong to one of these denominations that claims allegiance to Calvin in that sort of way? However, what people more often mean when they say, are you a Calvinist, is, do you hold a certain doctrine of predestination? Calvinists and Arminians. Calvinists believe in predestination, Arminians don't. And at least not in the sense that Calvin did. And that tends to be the sort of popular usage of the word Calvinist. We'll come back to that. Finally, for some people, when they say, are you a Calvinist, they mean, do you believe in this TULIP? Who's heard of TULIP, the acronym? Yes, a lot of people. Do you believe in TULIP, which I'll come to in a moment? And for some people, that is the criterion of Calvinism, in which case we'll have to ask ourselves in a minute, was Calvin a Calvinist? But anyway. So let's turn to the next slide, to TULIP, an acronym of the so-called 5 points of Calvinism. And first of all, I want to go through them and explain what they each mean, and then we'll revisit them and compare them with Calvin. Well, the T stands for total depravity, not meaning that the people are born totally depraved, not meaning as bad as they could possibly be, because manifestly that's not true, but the whole of human nature is affected by sin. That not just our wills, our minds, our emotions, the whole of human nature has been affected by sin. And this was held not just by Calvin, actually classic Arminians believe in this as well, and certainly all the reformers believed that. Then we have unconditional election. Basically, this is where the real crux point comes between Calvin and Arminius. For Calvin, God chooses us not because of anything in us at all. God's election is not based on the fact that he foresees that we will believe or foresees what marvelous works we will do. Whereas for Arminius, your election as an individual is based on the fact that God foresees that you will come to faith. So is election unconditional, or is it based on God forcing something in us? L, limited atonement, sometimes referred to as definite atonement. The belief that Christ died not for everybody, but specifically only for the elect. Then I, irresistible grace. The need for God to make the first move. Now, the word irresistible, I think, is a very unfortunate wait a sec. No, I think I'm going to say that in a moment. Mustn't get confused. Yeah, okay. Basically, then, Arminians also agree, or classical Arminians, that God makes the first move. But the question is, what happens when God makes the first move? When God makes the first move, does he work in such a way as to ensure that the person comes to faith? Or does he just bring people to a position where it's up to them? They can make up their mind one way or another. So the idea of irresistible grace is that when God's grace is given to people, the result is inevitable. And finally, the P, the perseverance, or sometimes called the preservation of the saints. The issue here is, can somebody who's genuinely a converted Christian lose their salvation? And there are people, of course, who say, yes, they can. But this P says no. No, if you are genuinely a Christian, you will persevere. God will preserve you. God will keep you to the end. So these are the 5 points of Calvinism. Now, what I have to say is, may come as a surprise, these do not originate with Calvin. In fact, this tulip originated about 100 years ago. So it is quite a modern idea. Although, to be fair, the individual points that make it up go back a lot further. But the pulling it together like this is actually quite a modern idea. So what about Calvin and tulip? Do these doctrines come from Calvin? Are they a fair summary of Calvin? And my answer to that is no, it's not an accurate portrayal of Calvin. Not altogether. So let's again go through these same 5 points and ask this question of each. First of all, total depravity. Well, the idea is most certainly there in Calvin. What it's saying is one that Calvin very definitely, and not just agreed with, but emphasized. Although I think the wording is perhaps unfortunate, because people hearing that will think that it's saying, as I suggested earlier, that people are as bad as they could possibly be. And that's manifestly not the case, that people aren't. Even the sort of monsters like Hitler can be capable of some good things. But basically, Calvin would be, leaving aside the issue of the word, and Calvin would agree with that. Unconditional election, well, Calvin most emphatically held to that, but this was not in any way original to Calvin. Augustine is the one who really set out that doctrine in the 4th to 5th centuries. Now, of course, some would say he was simply restating what the New Testament said. Others might not agree with that, but Augustine certainly was the one who formulated it very clearly. Many people, many theologians through the Middle Ages held to it. Not all. I don't know if it's statistically exactly which one would win out, but probably about half and half. So a significant number of medieval theologians held to this, that election is unconditional. And all of the reformers, not just Calvin, all the reformers believed this as well. Although I have to say, just declare one thing here, Melanchthon, Luther's sidekick, he initially believed it, but he had second thoughts about it later in his life. But apart from him, that change of mind, all the reformers held to this. So to say this is Calvin's doctrine is a complete misnomer. It was the Augustines, held very widely indeed during the Middle Ages. So who's the most famous theologian of the Middle Ages? Thomas Aquinas. Yeah, I mean, he held it very strongly, very strongly. So yes, it was held very widely during the Middle Ages, and all the reformers did. Right, L, limited atonement. This is a later idea than Calvin. And also, I would say, although this is a controversial issue, but I would say it is contrary to Calvin's teaching. And people have argued over this, people have written theses and books about it and so on. But I think the clearest evidence comes from the very structure of the Institutes. In Book 2 of the Institutes, Calvin talks about what Christ has done for us, and he ends up, the last few chapters, on the work of Christ on the cross. And then, beginning of Book 3, he says, now we see that what Christ has done for the human race, not for the elect, for the human race, is no use until the Holy Spirit applies it to us. So his view seems to be Christ has died for the whole human race, but the application of that by the Spirit is only to the elect. But the big debates on that topic came after Calvin, and certainly you won't find him addressing it as a controversial issue, but certainly that idea of limited atonement, which is part of TULIP, is I think, and as I think the majority of people do on this topic, this is not there in Calvin. And also, the majority of those who have called themselves Calvinists over the years have not held to it. So, although some people would say, you know, unless you believe in TULIP, you're not a Calvinist, well, that's their definition of Calvinist, and if that's their definition, then it's true. But the majority of people who have seen themselves as Calvinists after Calvin have not held to it. Then we have the idea of irresistible grace. Now, the idea it's getting at is there in Calvin and Augustine, but neither of them use the word irresistible. And I think irresistible is a very unfortunate word, and I'm going to illustrate that by thinking of a statement, I couldn't resist him. Okay, what does that mean? Let me give you two different contexts. He was so adorable. I just took one look at him and I couldn't resist him. Okay, that's one context. Here's a different context. He was so much stronger than me. He was so much more powerful, I was unable to resist him. You see, totally different context. The one about falling in love, the other an account of rape. So irresistible, I think, is an unfortunately ambiguous term. I must tell you the story about the man who was walking on the seashore and a bottle floated in, and he opened up, looked in the bottle, and there's a piece of paper, and it said, you have 3 wishes. So he thought, I've always wanted a villa by a Swiss lakeside. Bang, there he was, villa by the Swiss lakeside, beautiful, lots of rooms. And then, after a while, of course, the bills started coming in. So he thought, you know, what I need here is a numbered Swiss bank account with lots of money in it. There it was. There was the bank account, all the money he needed. A few more days went on, and he suddenly thought, you know, I'm really lonely here. I want to be irresistible to women. And at that point, he turned into a box of chocolates. So irresistible, the word has different meanings. Finally, the perseverance of the saints. Yes, there's no problem with that one. Calvin certainly believed in that and taught it very clearly, that somebody who is genuinely a Christian, God will keep them. You know, they may have ups and downs like King David did. There may be the odd murder and adultery on the way, but God will keep them to the end. Right, okay, next one. Calvin versus the Calvinists, with a question mark. Now, there are many writings that argue that the Calvinists have betrayed Calvin. And I'll give you a few examples here. I mentioned Beza already, who wrote his life, Calvin's life. He was Calvin's chosen successor at Geneva. And their theology was very similar, as you would imagine. Otherwise, Calvin wouldn't have been so keen on him taking over. But there are differences, and in particular, it's alleged that he placed greater emphasis on predestination, put it into a more central role, and certainly, obviously, no two people are the same, and there probably are some shifts there, but some people have portrayed it as if Beza and Calvin, Beza completely changes Calvin's teaching, somewhat of an exaggeration, I think, but inevitably one person will see things slightly different from another. And then Calvin versus the Westminster Confession. The Westminster Confession, who's heard of the Westminster Confession? Yeah, a number have. 1647, in the middle of the 17th century, produced at Westminster, the Houses of Parliament in London, and that's become the classic definition for Presbyterians. And there are clear differences at particular points between Calvin and the Westminster Confession. And I'll mention one in a moment, the question of assurance of salvation. So what Calvin teaches is one thing, what the Westminster Confession teaches, well, it's mostly the same, but with some significant differences. Predestination. Some people after Calvin turn predestination into a sort of central controlling doctrine, a doctrine which underlies all others to a large extent. And that wouldn't be true of Calvin. And Calvin, in his Institutes, doesn't come to predestination till over halfway through, although that is a little bit misleading, because, of course, it can still be influential before he talks about it. But certainly, there's no doubt some later Calvinism has made more of predestination than Calvin did. Limited atonement, I've already referred to that. That is a later development within Calvinism, and one which I would see is contrary to Calvin. Now, not everybody would agree with that, but I think I'm right in saying all the people who would disagree are people who have a vested interest, people who hold strongly to that view and want to claim Calvin for their support. Whereas I think those who perhaps don't have a dog in that fight, as we say, people who don't have a vested interest would be with those on the other side. But it is a matter of controversy. Then I mentioned assurance of salvation. I mentioned that already in connection with the Westminster Confession. For Calvin, assurance of salvation is part of saving faith. So what is it to have saving faith? It is to trust in Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. It includes the idea of assurance. And Calvin actually says things like, unless you trust that your sins are forgiven, then you don't have saving faith at all. So for him, it is part of saving faith. And at least in principle, therefore, all believers have assurance of salvation, although, of course, people struggle with doubt. Whereas with the Westminster Confession, it's entirely different. Having saving faith is one thing. Having assurance is something which you can, but may not necessarily, acquire at a later stage. Saving faith is one thing. Assurance of salvation is another thing, quite a different thing. So you see, for Calvin, assurance is part of saving faith. For the Westminster Confession, it's something that comes later, can come much later. It's open to everybody, but some may never attain it. So a very different view of that. And so because of these differences, and other similar ones, there are some people who would say that these later versions of Calvinism have betrayed Calvin. So the Westminster Confession, Beza, and other later versions are seen as betraying Calvin. So we should return then to ask ourselves, what is the relationship of Calvin to Calvinism? And here there are basically two main views. The first view, as in the top half, as it were, is that Calvin is the founder of Calvinism, and you see how the arrow goes. Basically, we move from Calvin to Calvinism, and nothing has changed. Well, obviously minor details, but basically Calvinism is the teaching of Calvin. That's one view. On the other hand, other people take the view that Calvinism is the betrayal of Calvin. And so you see the arrow sort of goes off at an angle. The idea is that Calvin taught one thing, but then along come these nasty people like Beza or the Westminster Confession, and they betray Calvin, they betray his heritage, and send things off in a different direction. Now, what I want to say is that neither of those views is correct. Neither view is correct. And so we need to step back before and sort of see the bigger picture. So what we start with is the first generation of reformers. The Reformation begins. In Wittenberg, there's Luther, and there's Melanchthon, his younger colleague, and they introduced the Reformation at Wittenberg, and that Reformation spreads throughout Lutheranism to obscure parts of the world like Finland and so on. And then on the other hand, we have Zwingli. Zwingli, who brought the Reformation to Zurich. Bucer, Martin Bucer, who was a contemporary of Luther's and Zwingli's. Initially, he was very keen on Luther, but then he moved to a more middle way and would generally be reckoned to be part of the Reform movement. So these are first-generation reformers. These are people who were around and active by the early 1520s. Luther and Melanchthon on the Lutheran side, Zwingli and Bucer on the Reformed side. Now, Calvin was just one among many second-generation reformers. He was second generation when he was converted to Protestantism around 1534. That is 17 years after Luther's 95 Theses. That is, I talked about first-generation reformers, early 1520s. We're talking now for Calvin, early 1530s. So Calvin is very definitely a second-generation reformer. But what happens is that as time goes on, Calvin becomes increasingly prominent. He wrote with such clarity and so on, and his writings were so much esteemed that Calvin became prominent in the Reformed tradition. And so as a result of that, eventually the whole Reformed tradition came to be known as Calvinism, rather than Zwinglianism or Bucerism, when it came to be called Calvinism. But he had not founded that movement. He was a second-generation reformer. So Calvin is not the founder of the Reformed tradition, and those who followed were not betraying Calvin. They were simply held a different position in that tradition. So, for instance, to say that the Westminster Confession betrayed Calvin is ridiculous. The Westminster Confession was not seeking to follow Calvin. These people were theologians who they were seeking to follow Jesus, and they're seeking to be in conformity with the New Testament. Of course, they had high respect for Calvin as a theologian, as they did for other people. But they didn't claim that they were following Calvin and replicating Calvin's thought. So their different view on assurance goes back not to Calvin, but to Bullinger. Bullinger, the successor of Zwingli at Zurich, was very influential. He's a big influence on the English Reformation, and it's his ideas that come through in the Westminster Confession in their teaching of assurance. Bullinger didn't betray Calvin. He was a lot older than Calvin. He happened to also to live longer because he lived to a ripe old age. But Bullinger wasn't betraying Calvin. He was a contemporary. They were around at the same time. They talked with each other as equals. So no one, to say that Bullinger betrayed Calvin is nonsense, any more than to say that Calvin betrayed Bullinger. And therefore, the fact that in certain aspects the English Reformation followed Bullinger rather than Calvin, they weren't betraying Calvin. They were simply drawing on the heritage of the Reformation, the Reformed tradition, whether from Calvin, Bullinger, or other people. And so no one was being betrayed. And then my last comment is to beware Calvinist and Barthian distortions. People who are trying to make Calvin say what they want him to say. And there are those who take a later Calvinist view, whether it's a Westminster Confession, Tulip, or whatever, and try and read that back into Calvin. And that's not being fair to Calvin. And more recently, much more recently, of course, than the Westminster Confession, Karl Barth in the 20th century, who was very much influenced by Calvin, but had his own distinctive stance. And there are those who try to read Karl Barth back into Calvin. There was one person who was a very stern critic of people who did that, and that is actually Karl Barth himself. He objected to people doing that, and I've got two, by oral tradition, two accounts of what Barth said, because I know somebody who was Karl Barth's last research student, and he said of, I'll just mention the name because some might have come across him, Tom Torrance, a very significant Scottish theologian who wrote a book called The Anthropology of Calvin, I think it's called, that's right. And Barth apparently said, Torrance describes what Calvin would have written if Calvin had first read my church dogmatics. So, he realized that Torrance was reading Calvin, reading Barth back into Calvin. And then also there's a man called Niesel who wrote a book called The Theology of the Calvin, which might even still be in print. And apparently Barth's comment was, Niesel reads Calvin through Barthian eyes. So Barth himself was very critical of people who did that. And it's fundamentally dishonest. I mean, let's look at Calvin, see what he actually said. We might not agree with it, well, that's all right. But let's at least just read him in his own terms. So beware people who are got an axe to grind and are trying just to read back their own ideas. Now, of course, we're none of us totally detached observers. Even if somebody was an atheist, and therefore with no sort of theological line to push, they'd have their own angle, their own axe to grind. So we're none of us totally objective. But that's one thing. People deliberately trying to read their ideas back into earlier writings, it just muddies the waters. So beware of that. Finally, I've got a little chart here of which puts all this in the graphic form. The development of the Reformed tradition. So you have Zwingli and Bucer, they're the first generation. And then you have Calvin, Bullinger, who are more or less contemporaries, Peter Martyr, another significant one, Musculus also, and they were all part of the Reformed tradition. And that Reformed tradition eventually comes to be known as Calvinism, much to Calvin's disgust. He, in one of his writings, he objected to people, calling it Calvinism. I mean, he would say, it's not my teaching, I'm simply putting forward what the New Testament teaches. But the word Calvinism is now used in that way for, as I say, this huge variety of views according to just, whether it's just belonging to the Reformed tradition in general terms or some specific point. So that's the historical reality of it.